All right, so this is actually going in the direction of applied. So in the domain of practice. And I should say that this is not necessarily going to happen, but the probability is building. I think we may have talked a little bit about the notion of what would it look like for Web3 to acquire Twitter? Did we talk about that?
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we did it publicly, but so the possibility of that, particularly if Elon pulls the plug on the deal, meaning there's a provision of the deal where the fact that there's a lot more than 5% bots causes the deal to potentially not be one that will be continued, possibly renegotiated, but the current terms would be broken, creates a window for this particular move. And I'm really right here not quite clear on whether to spend time in this particular conversation talking about the how, like how do we actually make the move? What I really want to focus on with you is the what, like what do we actually do? Yeah. So the big picture frame in terms of the how is something like we have a way of creating a new kind of agreement structure, incentive landscapes, and sort of a game theoretic construct whereby people who are currently holding what are sometimes known as Web3 tokens, and I include, by the way, Bitcoin in that category just for ease of naming, to give them a very good reason to choose to give some fraction of their tokens to a nonprofit, to a trust, for the purpose of acquiring Twitter from Twitter shareholders, for the purpose of moving Twitter into becoming a commons,
right?
A public commons stewarding dialogue, and furthering its development in the direction of enabling that function more broadly in potentially all directions, not just the Twitter UI.
Right.
So that's the how, right? And if you'd like, we can recapitulate that and dig into it, but that's not the key element here. The key element is that how is decently wired up and seems to be checking, like getting a lot of checks. Like I'm sending it out to different people. They're coming back saying, yep, that seems like a thing that could definitely work, and kind of checks boxes. So now we have the question of the what. Okay, so we bought Twitter and we've moved it into a public commons. How actually do we govern this thing?
Right.
And we've talked a little bit about that.
Yes.
And what I'm proposing now is that we're going to need to move into a more aggressive version of that conversation.
Let's do it.
And I was talking to Tristan Harris about this yesterday, as you might imagine has a very big role to play in this story. It's a big piece of what the Center for Humane Technology, sort of raison d'etre, would be about.
Right.
And I mentioned that in the story of the founding of the United States, the Declaration of Independence happened before the Constitutional Convention.
Yes.
Right. They said, hey, we're taking over this thing. We're taking the states are under new management. Yep. Then they fought a war. Then they figured out how to govern it. Right? They had something. They had an Articles of Confederation in place, which was not particularly great, but it was adequate. They held it together out of sheer competence and desire not to fall apart. Then they figured out how to build the Constitution. So just as an FYI, in terms of a way of doing things, I think that's actually not like a random artifact. There's something about the burning of the boats. There's something about skin in the game, commitment, responsibility that brings people up to a capacity that they don't otherwise have. Right? So
also exemplification. I mean, Washington plays a very pivotal role in exemplifying something, right? And then he carries that role into the presidency and refusing the crown and a whole bunch of things. There's a period in which in which exemplary individuals emerge that give a face to a particular project.
Interesting. I'm noticing actually a little resonance here with the possible conversation you and me and Jonathan might have.
I'm really hoping we'll have that conversation.
Me too.
Yeah, we'll have that conversation.
Very interesting. I feel like there's an unusually powerful resonance between that conversation and this conversation.
Yep.
Perhaps in spite of the fact they don't seem to be related at all, but I suspect they're quite related. So my basic sense of it is something like this. just as a kind of a framing in terms of the relationship between the what and the how. In terms of the how, there will be a process whereby an offer will be made by a trust that will say, hey, we'll buy Twitter from shareholders at a value of 1 share per token. And then there's a process, and this offer is open for, call it 6 to 9 months.
Right.
And then there's a process whereby those tokens are actually growing in value as people choose to stake their Web3 tokens into the wallet of the trust. And there's a point at which the game theory causes Twitter shareholders to start saying yes, and that begins to build momentum, and then eventually it flops to yes. Okay. That also starts a clock where we begin the process of having conversations around, okay, well, how do we actually steward this thing? And more importantly, so here's I've been really thinking about this as a little bit of like the nano diamond tip of the spear, meaning,
wow, that's cool.
the problem of governance and the problem of institutions is a fundamental problem in this moment in time.
Yes.
We don't really understand, we don't have the kind of governance capacity that we need to respond to the meta crisis and the meaning crisis.
Yes.
Our institutions are more or less adding fuel to the fire, even if they're trying really hard to do a good job.
Yes.
We need to actually inventio new institutions, and we need to inventio a new approach to governance, broadly speaking, across the entire field of human endeavor.
Yes.
As it turns out, dialogic commons is the center of the center. Right? If you don't have a dialogic commons, you can't figure anything out.
That's right.
If you do have a dialogic commons, it's the ground around which you can begin the process of addressing other things. Right?
Yes.
As it turns out, Twitter turns out to be an exemplary opportunity, both in terms of safe to fail, extremely meaningful, and awesome to win. So if you can solve the problem of governance in the context of Twitter as a public commons, you have simultaneously addressed meaningful questions of the problems of governance in the 21st century in general.
Yep.
You've done so in the context of something that's already at critical mass in terms of both number of people, diversity of locations and perspectives. It's a truly global platform. And the influence that it has over the public conversation. It will serve as the role as a dialogic commons, and therefore becomes the ground from which we can do the rest of the work we need to do. Right. So and as it turns out, our friend Elon has shaken things up enough that the possibility of that shift is quite relevant. Like we could pull it off. And if we pull it off using Web3 properly, we simultaneously demonstrate what Web3 was here for in the first place, give it its proper raison d'etre, and meaningfully shift big chunks of the rest of governance, which include things like money and agreements, into a completely new milieu and infrastructure that can handle the strength of what we need for the problems of the 21st century. So it's like, 19 synergy values simultaneously.
Yeah.
And super hard. There we go. But if we fuck it up, we don't fuck it up too badly, meaning, okay, worst case scenario, we just blew $40 billion and burned Twitter. Worst case scenario. And in the context of the world, that's not that bad. And a lot of things will be learned in the meantime. So it's like a really nice possibility. So when I look at it, let me think. Meta is the key. Right? We really need to be able to say, okay, look, we have a lot of received frameworks on how we do governance. And for the most part, those received frameworks are derivative, meaning they were largely developed in the generator function of the 17 and 1800s. They were developed in that period of time. And we've been kind of playing out the consequences of that cauldron of innovation for the past 250 years or so across the world. Right? Mostly that structure, the constitutional liberal democracy with multi-cameral division of powers, all that stuff, waged successful war on governance in general across the globe, and in various mutations displaced much of what was already there and is sort of established and has played out what can happen. And what I would propose, and I'm pretty confident about this, is that first thing we need to actually do is get all the way back to the place of being in the space of the generator function. And in fact, we had a really good language for this like 6 years ago, but it's like the generator function of generator functions.
Yes.
You get way up there.
Yes.
It's okay, what's the design that allows us to have the proper sort of design space for governance in general, which can then allow us to create the appropriate sort of design project for governance in Twitter. Right? So it's a two-step process. And this does things like, say, principles. Like what are the core principles? And what are the processes? And I mean, a few things that are obvious. Sorry, I just took an espresso. I'm clearly jacked right now. I apologize.
That's okay. That's okay.
Let's see. So one process is, go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add in terms of, in addition to processes and principles, I would want to talk about sort of implicit constraints and presuppositions as well.
Absolutely. Exactly. And that's exactly at the right level.
Yeah.
Exactly. And at the level of something like process, one of the processes we'd want to do is say, okay, let's begin the question of what are the implicit constraints and presuppositions? Like, let's actually make those explicit, and to the maximum extent possible, understand precisely what is the field of play that we're operating in. And something also along the lines of a meta process of being able to actually enter into a space of collaboration in contexts where our existing field of understanding is limiting. So this is the exaptive capacity to say, oh, we actually need to be able to exercise insight. And if we find ourselves caught in a double bind, we find ourselves caught in a sort of a room with no doors, we need to recognize that quite often it's because we're actually operating within epistemological or other paradigmatic constraints. There are doors, we just don't see them. How do we actually enter into a completely different mode to discover those different pathways? Lines of flight, my friend Judy Lewis would call them. So that's operating very much at the meta level, right?
Yes, exactly.
Other ones, these are nice sort of noticings, not key, but noticings, to be very clear on the distinction between intelligence and wisdom and the proper role of both. And this is, governance is a wisdom thing, where intelligence is brought into service of wisdom, but intelligence is not the appropriate faculty for making effective choices in the implicit.
Well said. Yes.
And then we can talk about what does it look like to discern and or cultivate wisdom in individuals and groups. That's a whole thing.
Very much. I'm very much interested in something I've been putting a lot of my life into trying to answer. Yes. So those are profound questions.
Indeed. Exactly. Yeah. So I've been a couple of things. So now I want to settle and recapitulate things that you've popped up. One was that notion of exemplary. So let me see what comes up for me there. I guess I'm okay. Sorry, Jonathan. I'm just going to bring some things up. It's okay. Well, this would be a precursor.
That's fine.
It's something like, I'll use a more neutral language, like archetypes.
Yeah.
Play a very important role in these kinds of things.
Yes.
Sort of like, Jordan and John or Thomas and Ben aren't the ones who are truly properly empowered to engage in this thing, designing governance systems.
Right.
It's more of an archetypal function. There's something going on that actually plays that role that is at a higher level than me as an individual, for example. To the degree to which I'm availing myself of the affordance of an archetype and becoming an instrument of that archetype, then I'm playing the role that is proper for me to play. And so it's, Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Constitution. His hand held the quill that wrote the words down, but there was something bigger going on and flowing through him in support of a much larger process. And again, the notion of archetypes. Washington felt a certain calling, and it was a calling that strengthened him in a way that an ordinary human with fragile ego may not be able to step into. The ability to feel the calling of history and to step into that calling, the vibrations of Cincinnatus saying, hey, there's something going on here that maybe George Washington can't really be, but there's another being who will be known in history as George Washington with a capital G and a capital W, who maybe can handle this in a stronger way. So that's one thing. Another is a piece that I've actually been playing with a lot for the past decade, which is, my friend Jeff Gomez calls it the collective journey, meaning that we're no longer in the space of the hero's journey.
No.
We're no longer in the space of a given individual holding an archetype, but rather it is a Sangha, that we're actually needing to find ways to come together into a space of collaboration where many people, in fact, potentially all people, are entering into this collaboration. Would I say something like, the word properly keeps coming up, but it's like in full surrender or in a kind of way, in a right way that allows the archetype to actually ground in humanity.
appropriate participation. That's, I think, what you're trying to articulate. And I mean
Yeah.
participation in the Platonic sense. I don't mean just taking part in.
Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah. And this is very powerful to think about this in the context of what are we talking about in terms of governance. And so let me make distinctions. I've said earlier, I don't think, I'm reasonably confident that a sort of a knee-jerk reference to the stuff that our founding fathers in the United States produced 250 odd years ago is going to behoove us perfectly. Like, it's nice, this is good stuff. Let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, but we need to throw out the bathwater.
Right.
But things like collaboration is core. That this is not a story. Sorry, let me make that. I need to make that distinction clear. This is a formal term for me, but it's not very well defined publicly. Forrest, Daniel, and I worked on this for a while, and we sort of just tag certain things. So we made a distinction between the term coordination and the term collaboration.
Right.
Even more formally is between type 2 coherence and type 3 coherence, if you really want to be nerdy about it. Coordination in this language takes place in the field of agreement. And it would be associated with things like semantics and defined terms and paradigms, right? And so, and I would say much of what's happened over the past 500 years has been an exploration of the possibility of coordination. Whether you're talking about markets or bureaucracies, you're largely talking about the playing out of that field, the field of agreements, the field of what paradigms can be and how we can actually cause simultaneously larger and larger bodies of people to coordinate their choices within particular kinds of paradigmatic constructs and bring distinct paradigms into increasingly effective and non-conflict based relationship. And that's effectively the essence of capitalism and liberal democracy, is playing that whole story out. And there are particular limitations of that approach. The proposition being that the resolution to those limitations is a completely different modality, and now collaboration, which takes place in the field of alignment, not the field of agreement.
Yes.
And it is able to participate trans-paradigmatically, which solves a lot of problems. And I'll give you a very concrete example. My wife actually was asking me this at breakfast. She's like, can you give me a simple example? And it's a little bit like, by the way, this didn't work for her, so it may not work here either. It's a little bit like we find ourselves in a room, and there's sort of two teams of people in the room, team 1 and team 2. And team 1, their paradigm identifies green as the color of doors for very strong reasons. Like, they're very profoundly oriented that green is the only valid color for doors. And team 2, red is the only valid color for doors. Okay. And we're in the room, and there's a green door and there's a red door. And we're now in the space of coordination, in the field of agreement. We have exactly 4 possibilities of what we might do. We might all agree with team 1. So team 2 says, you know what, we're going to subordinate our choice making and identify your paradigm as proper. Green is the right color for doors. Let's open the green door. Or we might switch, go the other direction. I mean, I might go with red. Or we might extend our paradigm to include a novel construct of and. Oh, green and red. Okay, cool, we're there. Or we might completely go crazy and just fight each other, which is kind of where we're in right now. But as it turns out, there's a totally different space. In the field of collaboration, we might look around and notice there's a completely different object, which is a very different color called orange. And it's a very different shape, but maybe it's the thing. We try the green door, it doesn't open. Try the red door, it doesn't open. In the space of collaboration, in the field of alignment, we're principally grounded in reality. We're no longer principally grounded in paradigms, right? Paradigms are not primary, they're secondary. Reality is primary. And in the space of collaboration, we can simply perceive what is and notice that if our paradigms are limiting our capacity to actually be in relationship with what is, we can simply use reality to guide us in making effective choices, something like that. And of course, there's a mapping between intelligence and wisdom here as well. Wisdom is very much of the part and parcel. Wisdom, maturity, what are some of the other ones that are key to the space of collaboration? Relationality, right? It's in the basis of relationality. So the proposition I would make, and this is very tricky, right? This is a conversation sort of like for you and me and a small group of people initially, is at the generator function of generator functions, collaboration, dialogos. Within that space, we can then begin the process of actually using collaboration and dialogos to discover all the various design elements. What is the field of the sort of design space of governance in the context of world in general and Twitter in particular, at which point intelligence can actually play.
Yes.
Sorry, let me just finish this last piece because it just came to me.
No, keep going. You keep going. You're on a roll.
So Vanessa says, that example does not land for me at all. It's like, all right, try this. Different story. In story one, we have 12 people and we're in a room. And in that room, there's a table, and on that table, there's a puzzle. And it's a very big 10,000 piece puzzle. And we are tasked with solving the puzzle, like assembling the puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle. This is a problem for which coordination is a very effective toolkit. Right? We have a finite and bounded problem. We may not yet fully understand the boundaries, but it's a finite and bounded problem. And it can be well-defined. Yeah. Once it's well-defined, we can then do things like self-organize into various kinds of teams that have particular roles and responsibilities. So you're taking corners, you're taking edges, you're sorting things by color. We can begin to engage in division of labor, and we can construct something functional to solve the problem. In fact, in principle, we could even create a machine intelligence which can solve that problem perfectly. All right. In room number 2, 12 people. There's a table. The challenge before room number 2 is to create a painting. Mm-hmm. Different kind of problem for which coordination is particularly inappropriate, as you can imagine, right? Even the question of, well, what should we paint? Or how might we go about deciding what we paint, right? The combinatorial explosion or the regression against the underlying epistemological assumptions of coordination explode, right? And you can't resolve it. Totally different gig, right? The gig of collaboration. That's the approach to solving that particular kind of problem. So I'm saying governance is of that sort, which is obvious, right? Governance is a human thing. It's a relational thing. It's a complex thing. There is no finite and bounded solution whereby we can create sort of the control structure and use ordinary cybernetics to govern humanity in the context of nature. And we actually just have to deal with the reality that it's intrinsically complex and then play with it and live in it.
So it sounds to me like this is a mapping just to help me get clearer, that coordination is what Kars would call playing a finite game, and collaboration is playing an infinite game, where the very playing of the game can change the rules by which the game is played. And that when we're talking about governance oriented towards well-being and the good life, we are not seeking closure and conclusion. We're seeking how can we continually step back, that's the meta move, and play with the rule structure as well as playing within the rule structure and constantly toggling between those. Am I understanding you correctly?
Quite, yes. And you named something that I think is quite important in terms of assumptions. If you're operating in the space of coordination, you are in fact bringing in a fundamental assumption of closure, of terminus, of ending, of finitude. Right? The coordination space is a finite game. Finite games end in a finite time. Very bad as a basis for governance, right? If your governance system has as an axiomatic, it will end in a finite time. That's not a very fun game to play. What we want to do is we want to play a game where the essence of the game is, in fact, to continue playing it, to continue opening it up and increasing richness, by the way, not just sort of rotate the circles, not just keep hitting sort of refresh on an addictive game of tic-tac-toe, but actually, what would it be like to invite people to play the best possible game in an ongoing exploration of how the fact that the answer to that question can become deeper and deeper as we become more and more capable of asking it and more capable of playing together. And that's the rocket ship.
And of course, that does line up with Dialogos, because a primary example of that kind of game is the conversation that has a life of its own, the conversation that is constantly resetting the parameters of the space within which we can speak and convey ideas to each other. So what that then opens up for me is the fact that because this is a non-closure oriented, we've talked about this before, we're moving away from perfectionist models completion models, finishing models. We're rejecting nostalgia, fundamentalism, and utopic totalitarianism, right? And so I part of what I want to do right now is to say, I want to try doing that. I want to try and say, what are the primordial parameters that we need to bring into play that have previously been completely transparent to us? We've only been playing within them, and we have never been playing with them. That's the question. And for me, I'm deeply influenced by a book I'm reading right now. I'm reading it with Dan Chappie, David Ohana's book, The Intellectual Origins of Modernity. And one of the things Ohana does that is really helpful is make a distinction between modernity and enlightenment, and how they actually are not identical. They have different parameters. And what we're seeing right now is, in fact, a civil war between these two different poles.
Ooh, that's nice.
Yeah, and we're locked into it. So just very quickly, enlightenment is the project. These will both be oversimplifications, and I'm doing them just for the sake of the fluidity of the dialogue. But enlightenment is the proposal of replacing God with reason and nature. That will reason about nature, and then that will be our source of normativity for how we change things, how we try to solve problems. And then modernity is what Ohana, I think, brilliantly calls the Promethean spirit. The Promethean spirit is what we can use politics to transform the nature of humanity. And so that the new man, right, the new human being is the fundamental project. And of course, that means that the ends always justify the means. And this, of course, leads to what he calls political nihilism, because you will always be willing to sacrifice all the old people. Sorry, I'm using that metaphorically, in order to realize the new person, the new man, the new type of human being. And of course, he says that, the Promethean spirit is the attempt to, and this is what utopia is. It's a neo-Gnosticism. It's an attempt to escape all limitation. And for me, I think this is particularly powerful in order to talk about the commons, and especially in connection with Web3 and social media, because I see social media as exactly like driving these things, but also causing them to misapprehend what they're doing. So one response to all of this is a fundamentalist nostalgia. What we'll do is we'll just dig deeper in to whatever set of tenets we think represents the golden age. Or you get the Promethean spirit saying, no, we're going to be the project is to free us from all limitations. And then what Ohana suggests you got in postmodernism is the Promethean spirit has turned on the Enlightenment spirit and is basically capturing it and saying, no more reason or nature. Those also hold us back, and we shouldn't be held back. We should be unlimited liberation. And so one of the things I would want to bring in is, again, these rules, the Enlightenment rules and the modernity rules, and say, how are we going to be different? So I strongly resist the idea that what we're going to give here is and see, one of the things that impressed me about Civium was you were trying to balance the human capacity for transcendence off against the fact that we are always essentially limited, embedded mortals. And you were trying to keep the two of them, right, in proper relation. Drew Hyland talks about Plato's project of finite transcendence. We are beings that are capable of transcendent while always remaining finite, right? And properly putting aside the Promethean spirit that drives totalitarianism and the nostalgic longing that drives fundamentalism, that is something that I want to understand. How do we do that? I mean, we can talk about it, and that's one thing, but what is it? Like what is it? These things are so deeply entrenched in our cultural cognitive grammar. What is it we are offering to people if we're not offering them
Nice.
the return to paradise,
Nice.
or the absolute liberation into the utopia? What is it we're offering?
1 second.
Yeah.
1 moment. I'm actually going to pause. All right.
So I could just speak to two mythic and show how powerful these two myths are.
Mhm.
And we get them provocatively enough, one from the Greeks and one from the Hebrews, the Jews, or however we're supposed to refer to this heritage. So the great Greek myth is the Odyssey, which is the return home and to reset things back to the way they should be. It's the ultimate nostalgia. That's a great myth. And that, right, that is in our culture in profound ways. The other myth is the Abrahamic myth, the promised land, the journey or the Exodus, the journey to the promised land, Star Trek, the final frontier, right? And so, right, that what we're always doing is we're journeying to find the promised land. So that you have the myth of the return home, fundamentalism, nostalgia. You have the myth of the journey to the promised land, the utopia, the fact that human beings will have the capacity to make their history, make themselves, create themselves beyond themselves, etc.
Nice.
What are we offering people if we're offering them neither Odysseus nor Abraham?
Man, you're taking out a lot of the tools, aren't you?
Yeah, yes.
It's funny because part of what immediately comes up for me is, for many years now, I've been talking to Vanessa about the fact that I feel like we are entering into the post-narrative era.
Yes. Yes.
So we are replacing living in a narrative for living, just living, ordinary actually life. So what are we offering? We're offering better relationships with the people who you love the most. We're offering less backache, less eye strain. We're offering a more meaningful life in all the dimensionalities of actual livingness. That's what we're offering. That's what we're talking about. So this notion, I would say, if I feel this energy here of the enlightenment, and then I feel this energy here of the Promethean transcendent, what I'm noticing is both, like, we talked about intelligence being in a domination role as opposed to in a service role, right? Yeah. Well, transcendence can have the same kind of vibe, right? So I'm saying, hey, life is here. Livingness, life. When intelligence, enlightenment is in service to life, then it's in its proper place. The same is true of transcendence. When transcendence is in service to life, it's in its proper place, right? And life is the real wholeness and the wholesomeness, the holy. When we say holy, 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 we're referring to that. We're referring to that thing. And where transcendence and intelligence are actually in relationship to each other, mediated by a dynamic unfolding of actual life. This is what we're here for. This is why we are living beings. This is why life is intense and painful. And we're born and then we die. Like that's the thing, right? I'm inviting you to be born. And I'm inviting you to die. And I'm inviting you to live the space in between as meaningfully and deeply and richly as you possibly can.
You did something else there that was really cool, right? Because modernity and enlightenment both had as their target humanity, and you're shifting off humanity to life. And I think there's a rich move being made there. And we don't want to lose all the gifts of the Enlightenment. We don't want to lose the category of personhood. But what I noticed you're doing is you actually shifted to a category that's less anthropocentric in a powerful way. And it goes a lot with what's happening in 4E Cog Sci, where we're trying to understand, human cognition in terms of the principles of life, especially non-human life. I'm reading Uxkall's book on a foray into the worlds of animals and humans and a theory of meaning. And he does this thing where he can take you into the Umwelt, the world of the fly, or the world of the dog. And what I realized, and I was talking to Guy, and Guy Senstock and Christopher Mastropietro on this. We recorded this conversation about how that imaginal extension of eidetic induction has to also be trans-specific. We have to also, right, realize that although they can't speak, we need to bring the worlds of other living things into our discussion so that our capacity for seeing more of the multidimensionality of reality is phenomenologically disclosed to us. Did that make any sense?
Absolutely. It's very powerful because if you bring into the conversation earlier about collaboration and coordination,
okay. Yes.
Our capacity to coordinate with, let's say, a person who slightly disagrees with us is almost impossible. Our capacity to coordinate with a fly is categorically impossible. I can't actually form agreements in that concept. But I can be aligned, right? We are all part of life. We're all part of the universe. We're all part of world, but there's a wholeness that we are part of. And by virtue of that, we have a capacity of being in relationship. And now the question is, what's our right relationship? A very different conversation.
Yes.
Something else that comes to mind just in a moment in terms of the notion of enlightenment and modernity. It's so interesting, actually. I noticed that I actually have a call right after this that is going to be about indigenous wisdom. And for whatever reason, I've been invited into a conversation as with people who have a more proper claim on that topic than I do, although I am indigenous at least to Earth, as far as I know. Some may argue otherwise. I'm definitely indigenous to the universe. That I can feel very comfortable with. And I was involved in a very interesting conversation. I want to say like 3 or 4 years ago, and it was an inquiry that was kicked off by the Dene people about science. And it was using the talking circle psychotechnology. And so therefore grounded in their particular lineage, but inviting a lot of different folks in, including myself and some a gentleman, for example, who was a Sufi imam. So quite a diverse crew.
Right.
And one of the points, and many things landed there. There's a pretty profound process, actually. But one of the points that landed for me very beautifully was something about the mapping. If I think about it in terms of like the human constellation, like the human family.
Okay.
And all the different sort of typologies of humanity. And I try to say, okay, what is the archetype of the human typology that is most fundamentally associated with both enlightenment and modernity? And the answer is, in fact, a 22-year-old male. Right. It's an extremely, almost, and by the way, with the neotenic 22-year-old male, right? So extended adolescent, masculine. Vibe, highly competitive, very recklessly competing to establish dominant positions in the field of intellectual, practical endeavor. Right? Remember the Enlightenment wasn't just using reason, it was using reason in relationship to nature, not just reason in relationship to nature, but reason to dominate and control nature.
Yes.
Right? Yes. Remember the whole story, like I will put her on the rack and extract the truth from her. And it was not shy about explaining exactly what it was about. And adventure, right? Going out on ships and traveling to far distances, like that energy. Modernity less so, but you can still feel, the energy of we're going to put humanity, in front of us, and it's an engineering project par excellence.
Very much. It's social engineering coming to the foreground as the project that human beings should most engage in.
And what I would propose, again, is sort of a very simple thing, is that there's a very, very proper role to play for neotenic men. And the adolescent male is a part of the human family, and it's good for him to do his job. But he's not the whole of the whole family, nor should he even be meaningfully in charge of much, right?
Yes.
Having been a 22-year-old man for about 20 years, I have a very deep sense of what that particular typology is capable of and what its distinct incapacities are. And another part of this invitation is, hey, we need to reclaim the whole of humanity and put everything back.
That's brilliant.
Relationality.
That's brilliant. I like what you just did. You brought in another sort of a set of other parameters about this, which is, I hadn't thought about that. Sort of what existential mode, what developmental stage is being implicitly assumed as the one that should govern how we enter into all of our relationships and all of our activities. I hadn't thought about that, Jordan. That's very, very good, and it fits well with everything we're talking about here.
Yeah, I just think about like the problematic, and I will be quite, as you know, I'm not shy about this. I'll be accusatory. No, I'll be properly diagnostic of our boomer brethren. But if you take a look at the landscape of the typology of the folks who are filling roles of governance in our current political system, regardless of their age or their ostensible gender, they are all acting as adolescent males. And that the whole thing is just a giant pissing match between not even mature men, much less whole humans. And that's the gig, right? You get what you pay for. Like if that's your archetype, then eventually that archetype will work its way out and be the thing, and then you begin to discover how poor it is as a primary structure. It's extremely effective at certain things, and this is the key, right? It actually enables you to have the Machiavellian short-term victory over everybody who doesn't pick that tool, which is why it succeeded. Machiavelli had said, "Hey guys, hey Prince, here's the deal. You don't want to really reinforce these science guys doing their science thing, because that changes shit, fucks shit up. It's gonna make it difficult to keep governing properly. But if the town next to you does, and he gets a trebuchet that can break down your walls, then that fucks shit up even worse. So you're in a trick. You're going to have to do it. So you want a minimum viable amount. Well, okay, that's an arms race. And so we actually have found ourselves caught in an arms race of the typology of the game theoretic discourse of everybody being forced to play the role of hyper-competitive 22-year-old men. This is a very good way of describing a lot of the problems we have. Eliezer Yudkowsky recently wrote his definitive piece, and he was quite clear in saying, look, I wasn't able to get this thing as clean as I'd like it, but here it is, about his point of view of why we're super, super screwed with regard to AGI, artificial general intelligence.
Right, AGI, yes.
And he's the guy who's been thinking about this and writing about this by far the longest and most deeply of anybody, I would say probably full stop, but certainly in the top 5 or 10. And I think in many ways, it comes down to something very straightforward, which is what we were just pointing to, right? An entire social system premised on the cultural logic of an arms race around weaponizing adolescent masculinity is going to get us all killed. And it'll probably get us all killed by virtue of an arms race around technology or scientific technical innovation. So that's kind of like another side of the Promethean enlightenment dynamic.
Very much, yes.
So another thing we'll be giving the survival of the human species. That's another kind of thing I put into the list of stuff on offer in this new model of governance. And it's funny, right? If you read his thing, you can tell he's actually in that box of coordination. I'm saying, okay, I've explored the room, and the red door doesn't get us out, and the green door doesn't get us out. So I think we're kind of fucked. The answer is, yep. Yeah. We're going to have to look for a portal. Right? A thing that doesn't look at all like what we think is a door in any way, and yet is a way for us to get out of this box we're in. Another piece of the interesting story that's a little far afield from Twitter governance, but as we said, it's I
don't know. I think it's not as far afield as you're saying. I think there's ways in which Twitter incentivizes the kind of attitude that you see in adolescent males in terms of how they pronounce propositions and how they interact with each other. I don't think it's far afield from Twitter as you initially thought. I think it's a lot closer to making everybody get into this kind of adversarial conquest. I'm going to shoot you down thing. Nice. Let's remember that the young males are the demographic group most associated with violence.
Yeah,
and so that's the dark side. I wanted to.
Let's do just. I'm going to put in there, and I'll say it, and then we can stop. The algorithm is also key, right? Yes. Safe to fail probe. The problem of how do we actually cultivate an algorithm to properly allocate our collective attention in a fashion which is in alignment with supporting our individual well-being and in support of our collective or the well-being of the whole is a design constraint on the top of this governance. Like any action we take in the context of governing Twitter must be governed by that principle. A safe to fail probe.
but more specific, maybe more specifically, right? So one of the things I would argue is driving the replication in science is an incentivizing of very much the individual innovator, the 22-year-old adventurer, right, who's discovered something new. This is what is incentivized right now especially within psychology. And people who are instead trying to integrate all of this different stuff into a coherent framework are often ignored and backgrounded. So you have an innovation over integration incentivized structure that again puts people into the mode you are properly in when you're 22, which is I have to go out into the world, I have to innovate, I have to carve out, listen to the language, I have to carve out, I have to leave my mark. We're doing all this stuff. And again, that is a proper part of human development. I'm not denying that.
Yep.
But what we forget is, but what about the people who do the work of integrating all of these innovations together into a coherent whole, right? There isn't, right? You've invoked wholeness, but we don't incentivize the kind of practices that are oriented towards wholeness as a primary thing. We incentivize on Twitter people who can startle, who can be suddenly strike out and say something salient, and right. And so there is very much an incentivization of people not working together, but being engaged in the fundamental project of the 22-year-old, which is I'm always defining myself. I'm always pushing myself into the world. I'm always expressing myself. And there's less and less of, but how does what I say integrate with other people? I don't see Twitter providing any incentive for that whatsoever. Like, what if we really valued, hey, what Susan said really integrated well with what Peter said. Let's incentivize that. Let's make that. We don't have that within the Twitter functionality at all. And for me, that means we are suffering exactly something analogous. What the replication crisis does is it undermines any credibility to scientific projects, because we just, right, we realize that all of this stuff that gets thrown out disappears. It becomes ephemeral. It's the same thing with Twitter. You get the problem of innovation without integration is it becomes ephemeral, and that is part of the problem with Twitter.
Okay, so there's a whole bunch. Let me recapitulate a bunch of different pieces. So one, vis-a-vis Eliezer in that cohort, we have a serious issue, which is there will be a point at which the rate of change in machine learning gets past our capacity to actually perceive the consequences and respond in any way appropriately. Yes. This is sort of first most important argument. Yes, I agree. I think this is correct. Two, as it turns out, the Twitter algorithm is a very safe to fail example of the basic problem. If we cannot wrestle the Twitter algorithm, which is sort of a variation of paperclip maximizer in the dialogical domain, as you're describing, if we cannot wrestle that into being wholesome and supportive, then we've got no chance with the bigger picture. Okay, great. Let's try here. Like, this is one of our problem domains. We need to move one of the principal problems of anything that's going to be governing Twitter and anything else that is a machinic modulated attention allocation piece of the dialogic commons. And there's lots of other variations on that theme. YouTube is a great example, number two. It's got to figure out how to solve this problem extremely well. And it'll be doing it. All right. Two, there will be an evolutionary dynamic. What I mean by that is it will be embryological. We are not going to get the right answer out of the gate. No. Right? Yes, of course. We're going to be fucking up less and less and less, right? That's a good way of thinking about it. Or as Dave Snowden says, less like this, more like this. We want to be on a vector that is orienting in the right direction and is increasingly rich, increasingly holistic, like actually able to take into consideration a broader and broader set of all the characteristics of the whole, increasingly mature in the sense that it's actually integrated deeply, fully, like richly integrated, not just sort of patched together shit, but is able to move. And okay, all right. And that's the kind of thing, by the way, that actually gets us to be able to deal with a problem of the order of magnitude of how does humanity come into right relationship with machinic capacity, which is, one of the consequences of the enlightenment modernity. What would you call it? Telos.
Yes.
Okay, there was one more. This is slightly different, but in terms of what's on offer, there's sort of two really interesting offers. If you happen to, in fact, actually be a 22-year-old male, or so, like in the sort of 16 to 28 or so, the offer is to actually bring you back into right relationship with a fully functioning society, so that your contribution is meaningful. All right, so that you're not a degen. And I mean that in the Web3 sense, and I mean it in the broad sense. The replication crisis is this, just the degen playing the filling that niche in science, right? How do you achieve local selective advantage in a finite win-lose game theoretic dynamic where your choices intrinsically corrupt the thing that you are participating in, right? That's a degen. Right? And everybody who's playing the sort of late stage, obligate, feral, 22-year-old male role in the contemporary environment is playing that role. And I would propose that's not a good role to play. Like nobody wants to play that role. It's a terrible idea. Most of all, but very importantly, 22-year-old males. You want to be connected to something where you are actually making valuable, meaningful contributions to something that is larger than yourself and will produce durable world that honors you for who you are and supports you in a continuing growth into becoming a mature human being who's participating in the whole world. Right? That's what you want to be part of. So that's the offering. Right? By the way, for everybody who doesn't happen to be a 22-year-old male, the ability to no longer have to wear that uniform to participate in reality and be able to actually be who you are, which may be very different than that. In fact, probably is for effectively everybody. Even say 30-year-old males. Okay. Maybe participating in life in a different fashion is really where you need to be, and pretending like you're 22 for the rest of your life isn't the thing for you. I would be surprised if sort of 70-year-old women feel really good about being forced to play the role of being a 22-year-old male. So that's another piece of the offer is that's what's good. That look like and how do we make that happen?
Yeah, so a diversity of viable lives is one of the things that's being offered. And then also I like this idea of dead reckoning. Right, what we're offering is a dead reckoning towards integration, or better, a dead reckoning towards complexification that can keep pace with the complexity of how the world is unfolding.
Ooh, okay, we got another one. It's intense. We might as well bring it up. So Twitter, right? This is a global phenomenon, and Twitter is at least as popular in India as it is in the States, maybe more so.
Yeah.
I think Modi is actually like one of the top people followed in all of Twitter. All right, well, we're going to have to reckon and finally resolve this whole challenge of diversity and equality. And I mean for real. I don't mean performatively or cynically, which is, from my point of view, most of what is happening with people who use that particular terminology. What I mean is to say, yeah, there's actually really cool, interesting things that are held by people that come from different places with different backgrounds and different life experiences. And by the way, different complete lineages. And for us to be able to really wholly be in relationship with reality, with the whole of reality, we need to be able to bring all of those different perspectives and integrate them into a richer perspective on reality. Like it's not that fucking complicated. Hard, right? I'm not saying it's easy, but it's not mysterious, right? That's the thing we need to accomplish. So another principle, right? Any valid governance for Twitter has to actually resolve that question categorically, like really, really figure out how to resolve that question.
But that would mean that people need to engage, people who are going to be partaking in the governance need to have engaged in the actual practice of cultivating the requisite virtues. They need to, I mean, this is what, this is what I'm trying to do with things like eidetic adduction and dialectic into Dialogos. How do you really properly recognize these other perspectives and be able to indwell them and internalize them to a degree without doing some imposition of assimilation or just seeking agreement? It's again about, right, what you have to, like, what are, Who are the examples of people who have cultivated the virtues and the virtuosity of collaboration? And what does that look like? And this lines up, by the way, with the stuff about AI. I just gave a virtual talk at Cambridge about intelligence is only weakly predictive of rationality, and rationality is only weakly predictive of wisdom. And so making something that is highly intelligent is no guarantee that we won't make machines who are not massively self-deceptive, massively irrational, and capable of astonishing degrees of vice, right? But if we want intelligence in service to self-correction, which is in service to virtue,
yes,
then we have to be able to exemplify it. Like the problem, one of the hidden parameters in the prioritization of intelligence was the fact that we have templates for it that are widely available.
right.
Problem we're going to face is we do not have widely available templates of rationality, let alone of wisdom. Rationality in the sense I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about the logicality of the Enlightenment. I'm talking about individuals who have demonstrated a domain general ability for significant self-correction, amelioration of their self-deception, and a significant ability to enhance the connectedness to themselves, to other people, to the world, and to enhance that for other people as well. We have a poverty of exemplars for that. And one of the things that any governance should be doing is, right, encouraging us to find and celebrate those exemplars.
I would go even further than that. So let me see if I can hold this piece here. What's the best way of doing it? I'll start from the back, work forward. So yes, and cultivate. So this is nice, right? Yes. The metaphor is something like, hold on, let me see if I can say it correctly. There's in much the same way that the distinction of coordination is defined in this conversation and collaboration. In the realm of coordination, there are processes that are dead. Right? We participate in them in much the same way that we use a vending machine. Right? It performs a function, we retrieve the transactional consequence of that function, then we move on with our lives, whatever it happens to be. And then there are processes that are alive. You've got this language, right? The participatory knowing. There we go. Right? By virtue of participating in them, we change. And we cannot participate in them without agreeing that we will change. Right? There's a choice of entering into that. Well, governance is that kind of thing. Right? So simultaneously, one is invited to govern to the degree to which one has, let's say, in fact, wisdom. I'll just put it simple. Right? One has, in fact, wisdom. And also, one is choosing to enter into a process, a crucible, whereby participation will change you. It will grow your capacity. It will test you and challenge you. And it will be a learning experience intrinsically. Right? You don't like go to university and then come back here and like govern. No, governance is the learning environment, right? It's woven together. It's real fucking life, right?
Yes.
And it has consequences that are real. Like, and this is why that notion of burning the boats. Like, this isn't a science fair experiment where we're going to say, hey, let's think really hard around how we're going to govern this thing, and then once it's all perfect, then we'll go do it. Like, no, this is that kind of thing where we have to actually be in it and living it with real consequences, and then step up and like grow into it. And we're going to try to find a way. Okay, that was the first piece. The second piece was something like, it's useful to remember that things like IQ tests and the SAT were produced by the military-industrial complex for very specific purposes.
Yes.
Very important, like the actual history. It's not at all mysterious. That's exactly why they were produced. And it's very interesting to think about how that creates an instrumentality of reason, or sorry, intelligence. Right? It's intelligence. How do I say this? Valorizing itself by virtue of making itself more legible to itself as an instrument for producing a selective advantage in an arms race based on technological capacity.
Oh, that's very good. I hadn't thought about that connection. That's very good, Jordan. You're on fire today. Wow, that's very good. That's very good.
Yeah. So, okay, that's a whole structure. And when we're talking about this other thing, which is about how do we discern wisdom and cultivate wisdom as the primary basis of governance, okay, that's a different vector. That's a completely different kind of thing. It doesn't look like an SAT test or an IQ test. It doesn't look like the military industrial complex either, right? It's and it's not intelligence sort of reifying itself. It's different grounding, a different surrender. So intelligence, you've got a role to play, but you're in service to something that is much more fundamental than you are. So we need to be practicing, allowing that more fundamental thing that is the proper faculty for making effective choices in complex environments to actually support that, right? And actually notice where that shows up, and then allow it, put some water in the soil of wisdom.
Yeah, that's well said. That's really well said.
All right, one more little piece, and then I think both of us have to go.
Yeah.
So as a practical, because it's very practical, one of the things that I've written into the how, this is just a small slice, but in terms of governance, for call it say 1/3 of the governance mechanism, individuals, people who want to get the franchise, right, and technically literally get the governance token, have to have 3 characteristics. One characteristic is they have to currently be on Twitter, right? So they have to be proper stakeholders in this commons, right? You don't govern the commons if you're not a member of the commons. 2, they have to be real humans. They have to be willing to undergo a proof of humanity that is strong enough to verify they are in fact actual humans, and not deep fakes or AIs or even pretending to be humans that aren't really, or pretending to be humans who they aren't really, who they really aren't. 3rd, here's a fun one. You ready? They have to actually agree to get off Twitter for the duration of the offer. Right? So there's this offer process. Let's say it opens on day 1.
Right.
To come in and get your governance token, you have to say, hey, I'm on Twitter. I'm a real human, and I will no longer be on Twitter until the end of this thing, until Twitter is transitioned into being governed as a proper commons. Now, the reason I bring this up is a number of people who are familiar with Twitter have said, wow, that sounds rough. And there are a lot of people who are, let's say, addicted.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Right? And for them to not be on Twitter is, whoa, it's like telling a heroin addict, I'm going to quit heroin. My response is, yes, exactly. Yes, precisely. Yeah. Hey, if you're addicted to something like Twitter so badly that you can't pause your membership for a couple of months, if you're so addicted that the opportunity to take fundamental responsibility for governing this platform to which you are addicted as an offer, as an opportunity, right, to participate in that as a peer governing this platform is not a strong enough offer for you to temporarily pause your addiction, then you don't fucking deserve to have any role in governing that platform, right? Yeah. It's very simple.
Yeah, you're doing Plato's philosopher king. Only those who don't want to govern should be allowed to govern. Only those, I get it. If we want people who are not addicted, right, either to power or to status or to be the people that are going to be in the governing council. Yes, very much. I think that's
proof of not being catastrophically addicted, at least to Twitter, right? It's as simple.
Yes.
Proof of stakeholding, proof of humanity, proof of not being in a disabling addiction to the platform itself. Those are the 3 kind of simple, there's probably more, but those are like, for as far as I've gotten so far, those are part of the protocol.
I think that's good. I think that's good.
I feel like we're getting ready pretty soon to kick off a program with Peter, where the Stoa may actually take this question as a fundamental inquiry and begin bringing in a distributed, decentralized, right? This certainly has to be highly decentered. My role in this begins to become very, very close to zero not long from now, right? It just evaporates to a small piece, highly decentralized. And I'm looking to see, obviously, the Stoa is one subset of a much larger world, but they have a nice sort of many different perspectives, many different backgrounds, a proven track record of doing good work. And then, of course, we got this Austin thing going on. And a lot of good folks will be there too. So we'll continue this conversation in only a couple of weeks.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I look forward to it.
Me too. All right, man. Thank you for allowing me to have this time to have this conversation.
Me too. Thank you. there was a lot of really juicy insights and revelations in this. I found it extremely valuable. Thank you. Thank you very much. And yeah, so our next time, I guess we'll be in person actually in Austin. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, see ya.
Take good care, my friend.